We're there.
We are live.
We are. And so, thank you everybody for coming to Southern Oregon Progressive Podcast. And actually, being engaged, folks who've been engaged. Um, let's see. So I had to do away with that. So anyway, try this again. Thanks everybody for coming. I'm Betsy Cunningham. And my co-host, I think, is in the room somewhere.
Hi, everybody. Yep, I'm here, Betsy. Good to see you again.
All
Thanks for
right.
everybody
So
for coming out again, as always. It's full crowd.
yeah, and tonight we're going to talk about some aspects of local control, and Zach is going to tell you everything he knows, and well, then that's probably more than we know about libertarian municipalism, right? Um, and really, it's about like I said, local control issues. So I'll let you introduce yourself, Zach, when you get to before you talk to speak. And how about you, John? You want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm John Hunter. I'm with Community Rights Douglas County and on the board of the Oregon Community Rights Network.
And how about is Max in the room? I don't see if Max is in the room. Let's see. Yeah, no. Anybody else want to introduce yourself?
By order, you'd be next, Dane.
Dane
Nobody
Zahner,
has to
he, him.
introduce themselves.
Dane Zahner, he, him. Just a Douglas County resident and community member.
Anybody else? If
I'll go. You can't see me, but my name's Bailey, and I am also just a resident of Roseburg. Um, and I will sometimes go to protests. I have many friends who are progressive, and I am trying to be more involved in the resistance.
thank you for coming.
Mhm.
Anybody else?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in.
All right.
Nick Mitchell, actually running for county commissioner, seat one.
All
I'm
right.
sure plenty of you. I'm sure plenty of you know me actually from the protests. I'm usually there with camera. Not often you see me without it or in front of it until much more recently. Yeah, that's it. Excited to be here. I join when I can. You know, it's hard when you got a kid, but I'm here for it.
I thought, yeah, thank you, Nick, and also thank you for running for county commissioner.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
anybody else? Anybody else?
Marilyn Wanabo here. Nick, I hope here during the meeting you'll remind people about the Commissioner Town Hall. I believe it's tomorrow night at the chamber at the library.
Yeah, you're right. Tomorrow, 6 o'clock at the Roseburg Library, we are having a town hall.
Are you guys gonna do that? You're also gonna live stream it?
Yes, it's been
Okay.
on Facebook every time. We're trying to set up another way to do it. We just haven't got to it yet.
All
I think
right.
we're going to try to
So
do a Zoom link for everybody to join as well. It's in the works.
good. Hopefully that happens. All
Yeah, I
right.
hope so.
Anybody else want to introduce themselves? All right. So, Zach Whitworth.
My introduction, huh? All right. Some of you know me. I'm Zach Whitworth. I was born and raised in good old Roseburg, Oregon. Lived in Southern Oregon for the majority of my life. Between Roseburg, went to elementary school and then eventually worked for a bit out in Glide. And then also spent a good number of my youth and adult years in Ashland down in Douglas County. So, Southern Oregonian through and through. I'm currently a PhD student and graduate employee at the University of Oregon in Eugene. I'm in the history department, so I am studying as a junior historian with focus on reading in history of Russia, the United States, and uh, revolutionary and utopian thinking. Um, I'm relevant to this discussion. I'm also affiliated with the Institute for Social Ecology, which has historically been based out in Vermont, where I'm enrolled in their mentorship program and have been involved for the last couple years now. I wear a lot of hats. And I'm on SOPP most every week.
So, what are you going to tell us tonight about libertarian municipalism?
Well, so you invited me on. I first wanted to ask what piqued your interest in the subject of libertarian municipalism, Betsy.
Well, because of the topics we've been having, right, about citizens' assemblies, the good governance, statement that you wrote about, the free government, and trying to figure out how that fits in rural Douglas County or it's rural Southern Oregon, right? With this idea, that it's a really, I call for lack of better words, myself a socialist, but I really have that libertarian bent. I just think in the true libertarian, say the Libertarian Party that is most common, I divert when it comes to the solution to economic problems and poverty, but on the social justice side. And I think there's probably a lot of people that have that kind of similar thing. And as you know, when I have extra time, I always tend to kind of look for resources and information. And then, I hadn't really studied this, particularly when I did all my deep dive into the world of left politics. It was before this was written. So, before the idea was promoted. So I just thought, how does that fit in with what we've been talking about? How does that work? And thought people may be interested since we're trying to do that here, right? We're trying to figure out a way to start implementing some of the things about citizen assemblies and local control and how people can be more a part of making sure our governance systems work for us.
Mhm.
Is that
Okay.
enough?
Sure. So I'm gonna be kind of off the cuff with most of this. I don't have anything especially prepared. Um, but throughout this, if anyone has a point or a question or a comment, feel free to just jump in. I think this is best done um, as a free-flowing conversation. Um, I think uh, I should first preface by saying that my understanding of libertarian municipalism uh, is partly my own. It's a highly debated, discussed concept, but I especially approach it as an historian. Um, so first thing I think should be cleared up. Betsy's the term libertarian, uh, and I think it's worth um, unpacking that term. So, for most of us in the United States, the term libertarian generally is associated with the Libertarian Party, um, generally favorable toward free, so-called, kind of impossible, so-called free market capitalism and a rejection of state or government control over economy, over personal life. Um, I the problem that we have when we use that word is we divorce the term libertarian from its historic meaning. So the term libertarian actually has a point of origin in France around the turn of the 20th century. And it was originally used by anarchists. This was a time when the term anarchism was being censored in the press. So you could not print the term anarchism or advocate anarchy, um, which generally was understood as a democratic, anti-authoritarian tendency, usually associated with left-wing politics, so an anti-authoritarian socialism. So the term libertarian, or in French, libertarien, was used in order to bypass censors to continue to speak about anarchist ideas in the press. Um, Most famous, one of the more famous anarchists, Elisée Reclus, I believe, was one of the earliest to use the term. So when we use the term libertarian in the United States today to describe the promotion of what gets called free market capitalism, that's actually quite antithetical to what it originally meant and what it long meant, which was a usually leftist or socialist bent that was strictly opposed to state domination, um, skeptical, questioning, challenging to hierarchy, but ultimately was committed to a communal, collective, mutualistic vision for a society. And so to that extent, I would say the term libertarian has been stolen, and I'm generally more inclined to call those who affiliate with, say, the Libertarian Party more as proprietarians. Proprietarian in the sense that they see that owning property is the highest form of liberty, to the degree that one really wants to just own the community. I see Bailey's got a hand up. You want to chime in?
Yeah, because what you just said about libertarian originally meaning, you know, pro community, pro socialism, and the like, it makes me think about the origin of the term redneck versus what it's become today.
Mhm.
And I'm sure you, being a historian, know what I'm talking about.
Yes, I've had that discussion with a number of people. When I think redneck, I usually think of the very famous labor wars in parts of the United States, like in West Virginia, like the Battle of Blair Mountain, for example, of
Yep,
miners fighting the government. But also, these were unionists. These
yep,
were revolutionaries, insurrectionists who were um, defending themselves against state tyranny and against capitalism, expressly. There's a famous movie among labor organizers. There's a famous movie called Matewan, Matewan, which is actually based on one of the early labor conflicts during some of those old wars, labor wars in West Virginia. Highly worth watching. Um, so again, so firstly, understanding that libertarian should be understood as meaning a strain of anti-authoritarianism, a questioning and challenging of domination and of hierarchy in virtually every sphere of life. Um, okay, so next preface thing, I should talk about uh, the philosophical origins of libertarian municipalism. So I mentioned I've been affiliated with the Institute for Social Ecology, which is really where the concept of libertarian municipalism has been developed from since the 1960s. Uh, Social ecology uh, is usually associated with the um, revolutionary philosopher, historian, social theorist Murray Bookchin. He was Russian Jewish descent, grew up in New York, ended up living most of his later life in Vermont, butted heads with Bernie Sanders in Burlington, but was involved in various areas of the um, uh, socialist and labor movements in the United States through the course of virtually the whole 20th century. Um, when he was when he was a kid in the 1930s, he was in the Young Pioneers, which was the communist youth program. His parents and grandmother were Russian socialists, uh, and he became a labor organizer in auto plants at the UAW um, in the 1940s. And uh, in the 30s and 40s, he became disenchanted with the Communist Party, which at the time, of course, was under the thumb of Stalin in the Soviet Union. And this was particularly after the show trials of old Bolsheviks in the mid 30s. Very famous old Bolsheviks like Bukharin were put on trial and executed by the regime. And this was seen by some as a betrayal of the um, revolutionary inclinations of the communist movement. And Bookchin leaned into the critiques of the Soviet Union that were being put forward by Leon Trotsky, a former Bolshevik Russian revolutionary who had been exiled from Russia when Stalin came to power, and he was eventually killed he was assassinated with an ice pick in Mexico in 1940. Um, so Bookchin's after the Second World War in particular, having been through auto plants and steel mills, and was a very active labor union organizer, um, began to find something very disenchanting in the developments in labor unions after the war. Um, he was finding that more often than not, those who might have once considered themselves working class, um, uh, laborers, even in unions, were starting to associate themselves and identify themselves as middle class workers. So they were increasingly identifying themselves with the more moneyed classes of society rather than standing in antagonism against them. Um, and in his view, uh, this was demonstrating something of a fault in old Marxist ways of understanding how a revolutionary movement could actually be um, driven forward. Classically, in Marxist theories of social transformation and revolution, the proletariat, which is the term that was often used to describe an urban working class, usually an very impoverished, owning nothing but their own ability to work. That was understood to be the most revolutionary class of people in society, and it would be them that would lead a revolution and establish a socialistic or a communistic society. But in Bookchin's view, especially after the Second World War, this did not actually seem to be the case. He found that in the labor unions and in these workplaces, these forms of laboring activity served more to regiment the worker rather than to imbue them with consciousness of their own class status, of their own domination. It conditioned them to be more favorable to hierarchical forms of organization and acceptance of union organizing as only being for the purpose of getting temporary concessions like wage raises, of securing health insurance and childcare services, etc. Um, so what was being identified was there did not seem to be a revolutionary tendency in this working class alone. By the mid 50s and 60s, he was involved in anti-racist organizing. He was involved with a group called CORE for a while, was active during the civil rights movement. But what increasingly came to the foreground of his thinking was the question of ecology, especially in the years when the Cold War developments were really centered on nuclear weapons development and also the proliferation of nuclear energy. And it was also in this period in the mid 20th century that journalistic investigations were finding uh, widespread use of chemicals, toxic chemicals in our daily elements of daily life that we take for granted, in paint, in household materials, use of chemicals like pesticide sprays on food crops, which were increasingly being related to uh, serious diseases, from cancers to birth defects in children. Um, so because of this, ecology came to be the centerpiece um, of his thinking. And what he increasingly came to understand was that the development of capitalism appeared to be increasingly coming into contradiction ever more so with the natural world itself. Um, so that um, uh, the the continued advancement um, of marketization, of social atomization, uh, the um, the advancement of imperial domination to secure new investments around the world for profiteers, that this was ultimately coming into a collision course with the natural world and could lead to the destruction of the possibility for at least human life, if not life as such on Earth. Um, so this is kind of the basis for what becomes the concept of social ecology, which is articulated really by the mid 60s. And this is also kind of book considering these things even before Rachel Carson famously published her book Silent Spring, which was considered to be a touchstone of the early environmentalist movement. Uh, so the concept of social ecology, um, it's become a very widely ranged school of thought with a variety of different opinions. There are philosophical and political dimensions of it. It's been explored and developed by countless other, not just theorists, but especially activists and revolutionaries in the United States and around the world since the 1960s. But in general, it is premised on a very basic notion that is ecological crisis. So you could include global warming in that, the detachment or alienation of humankind from the rest of the natural world, um, pollution, um, general ecological destruction. These are not understood as merely the results of our attitudes toward the natural world. We understand that social relations, economic relations, the marketplace, material conditions that shape how we relate to one another, these have a more profound effect than merely our attitudes toward the natural world. The usual phrase
Um,
we stick with is
yeah,
the domination of humankind over nature, as we understand it, stems from the domination of human by human. That,
so how would you take this concept of the libertarian municipalities, and how would you, like today? So I would think that, based on what you said, for one, I think the community rights movement or its predecessor is is an activist group, right? The Community Legal Education and Defense, right? For example, it's a lot of what they have organized around over the last couple of decades is about that. And they're the ones that I've paid most attention to. So this kind of fits in with the whole community rights movement, right? And we actually, that
yeah.
kind of,
So some of the founders of the community rights movement I've learned actually have relationships with faculty at the Institute for Social Ecology. Um,
mm,
the Institute for Social Ecology's founder, the anthropologist Dan Chodorkov, has noted before that the community rights movement, leading members of it, I think some of those who started CELDEF were in conversation with folks from the Institute back in the years that it was being started. So there's a strong affinity there. Um, so I suppose I should now get to where libertarian municipalism comes into the picture here. So we have this basic notion of the basic understanding of social ecology. Um, we understand ecological crises stem from social crises. Domination of the natural world stems from the domination of humans toward each other. So to actually address climate crisis, ecological crisis more broadly, we understand that we can't just change minds, so to speak. It's not just a matter of getting everyone to recycle or to eat a plant-based diet, individual lifestyle changes. To actually challenge and curtail ecological crisis, to grapple with it at all, we need social transformation on a global scale. Um, so, how is that done? Social ecologists usually consider libertarian municipalism to be the political expression of social ecology. We start from the libertarian premise. What forms of social and political organization uh, tend toward um, human freedom, tend toward uh, egalitarianism, tend toward the consideration of every life on the planet. We understand that democracy is key to that. Um, Democracy being, in our understanding, a participatory politics, one person, one vote, um, in forums in which people come together to make decisions directly pertaining to their immediate lives. Um, uh, we understand this to be the we understand this to be a basic form of freedom that historically has, although well, with complications, has generally stood in contrast to forms of domination and hierarchy from which we see the ecological crisis stems. Um, so historically, libertarian municipalists identify this tendency usually in forms of what we would now call assemblies. Um, so on the level of, say, a town or a village or a neighborhood, a popular assembly, or it could be called a neighborhood assembly, some might call it a citizens assembly, um, involves people of these communities coming together in political bodies um, and on a at least relatively egalitarian basis, um, deliberating, discussing, educating each other, and determining what courses of action need to be taken to sustain lifeways of that community together. And from there, those bodies uh, administer and delegate tasks to members of the community to carry out direct actions to keep everybody alive, to satisfy needs, and especially desires. Um, so these have appeared historically in forms like in old Russia during the period um, uh, of of Kievan rule in Russia. So this would be in like the 13th century. There are forms called the Vietcha, which were democratic assemblies, even though at this time, at least in name, um, many regions were headed by somebody with the title of a prince. Um, in um in practice, the communities of this period, which spanned from what is today Ukraine up through areas like Novgorod in Russia, these would be governed by members of households coming together and deliberating and discussing and educating each other and making decisions and electing administrators and delegates and managing the affairs of their own lives and their own communities. Serious local power. Um, this has also been, this is one example, this has also been a cornerstone of revolutionary movements in even the modern period. In the Great French Revolution of 1789 through mid 1790s, we often think of French Revolution as uh, uh, armed uprising, storming of the Bastille, storming of the armories, the cutting off the head of a king. But what drove that revolution were neighborhood organizations, the sections in each neighborhood in Paris, where neighbors came together and managed the affairs of their neighborhood together and federated together, sent delegates to a central committee they reported decisions to. Deliberations in that central committee sent people back to the sections to approve and carry out. Similarly, this is identifiable in the American Revolution. During the American Revolution, we often think, as is taught in history classes, we have these founding fathers with brilliant ideas who love writing documents, and they really hate the king over in England. But in fact, the American Revolution was driven by town meetings and popular assemblies, provincial assemblies, many of which had even predated the revolution itself. Uh, they came together forming confederations, forming committees for local governments, for public safety, committees for corresponding with one another. Um, and these form the bedrock of resistance against the increased domination militarily um, in the late 1770s by the British Crown. Um, and it was, in fact, when was it? It was the 17, I want to say it was 1775. I'm spacing it, 74 or 75, following the famous Boston Tea Party when the British Empire imposes a military occupation in Boston and cracks down on popular politics in Massachusetts. The main entities that they went after were the town meetings and popular assemblies. They understood these to be the basis of threat against the power of the monarchy. People coming together, organizing in their towns and municipalities, confederating, being in conversation with each other, and um, engaging in direct action to take care of their communities and also to weed out royalists in their areas. Those were the major threats. Um, Many, of course, were armed as well, which was another element. So
Melissa puts in the chat about, how do you apply that history to here we are today? And then when we when we messaged about, today's program, I put in there about the connection not only to the community rights movement and what community rights is trying to do, but also the effort that's going on right now in Roseburg. And I don't see that Max is in the room yet, but to have a people's homeless commission really in response to the failures of our homeless commission. But and this would be a parallel movement, right, in the homeless commission, but I could see that for other things, and even the broader concept of, people are dissatisfied with county government, and really we need a home rule charter, right? We don't have a home rule charter. But, you know, in the revolution, they have a galvanizing thing about, they're pissed at the king. But I see, people come together in movements all the time when they're usually pissed, right? They're pissed at whatever's going on. And so let's say these things happen, how do they become more ingrained? So, answering, if you can answer Melissa's question, but how do they become the way going forward? From my biased perspective, I don't see that we can survive with the current system we have with so few people making decisions, that really don't, that have all this special interest in anyway.
yeah. Um, so historically, this applies to virtually any of the revolutionary periods. This is the case in the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the various French revolutions. There are several more in the 19th century. The Russian Revolution, the German revolutions, English Revolution. Most of these start with affinity groups of people with shared interests of some sort or another coming together, discussing, educating each other, um, coming to understand what are the critical issues that we have to grapple with. Sometimes they're reading together and sharing writing with each other and beginning to develop what we would now call a radical press, forms of challenging criticism, social and political criticism, and also from these bodies forming into sometimes what we would also call mutual aid organizations that engage in direct action in their communities. In Roseburg, I would say the Food Not Bombs group has done this. I'm actually very glad to see that a chapter was started. But that's a form of direct action. A group comes together and figures out, okay, we have an immediate need. People need to be fed. So through this group, the decision is made to feed people. Um, and direct action, importantly, strictly means to act as though the government doesn't exist. And effectively, in cases like these, it doesn't seem to exist as anything but a force that is working to impede direct action, impeding people getting fed, impeding people getting housed. Um,
I'm gonna say on the mutual aid, I would say that the organizations here that may appear to be the mutual aid is not just charity, right? It's not just feeding people, it's just not giving them what they need. It's helping to empower them and engage them. And the Panthers, the Black Panthers are probably the most known group for, going in, doing things in their community that they saw, in the ghetto, kids weren't getting proper schooling. They had, after school programs. So they met those needs, but they're also educating the parents about the, lopsided system as to why the children there. And so it also takes the form of political activism, right? So it's that empowerment. So, unfortunately, and this is a topic for another show and should be, is the controversy of a lot of these organizations, even like community rights, becoming 501c3 charities, which Housing for Some is also that charity, and how that really changed the structure of what these mutual aid organizations, starting with welfare mothers in the 60s, creating Head Start and what is now UCAN in our community, that they really, and it kind of, the argument is that gets co-opted in. And so then they're chasing money, they're trying to support their program, they're no longer focused on helping make systemic change. So I think that's what we have in the Homeless Commission that's the city run. It's all those institutionalized people who raise money. So, and so the way that I hope that this one evolves is we're going to look at all those things you mentioned. We're going to look at the issues at work. Look at that data and say, this is what we should plan. But I don't, it has to work at some level with that interaction with the government itself, right? Because a citizens assembly of what we're looking at, we can make some brilliant plans, but we still have to convince the people in government seats that this is going to be the city's plan. So how do we do, is there a way that you see doing that? I mean, we can run people for election, right? But that's going back into that system, and that's really where I think we're going to end up being is, at this point, I call for the replacement of various people on the city council, right? That if we want to address homelessness humanely, there needs to be different people making those decisions on behalf of the city. So how does that integrate together in today's world? And then Bailey has a question or a statement too. I see her hand raised.
yeah,
Yeah, I don't have a question. I have a solution. The thing is, even though I don't have the specifics, I know where to start. The the thing is, these people do not act because they are not threatened. One, I've been through a lot of um, deconstruction trauma in my 20s and late teens, and one of the biggest things I've learned about that is might makes right. That doesn't have to look evil though. It just has to be enforced. I mean, might makes right does not always look like, the big mean, bully animal eating the small baby prey animal. Sometimes it looks like a collective taking down the king that got way too comfortable in his ego and power. But but where we start is, how do we use our leverage? How do we lever against these politicians that aren't doing jack shit for us? I'm done.
Dan, you want to chime in before I answer?
No, I can ask my question after Zach. You go ahead and answer that one.
Okay. Um, so I want to address, so Bailey, you talk about leverage. I think the big question that everyone has to ask is what leverage? What
Yeah.
is our leverage? Um, I especially study Russian history as well as U.S. history. Been focusing on like what made the revolutionary movements possible in Russia. Um, the major engine, municipal engine of the revolutionary movement in Russia uh, was the form called a Soviet. We usually there's a misconception when we say Soviet, we might be referring to people who lived in the Soviet Union. But the concept of a Soviet is actually a workers' council, or workers or soldiers' councils. Sometimes they're peasant councils. These are democratic assemblies, in fact, which federated together and coordinated activities. And they existed in most cities in the revolutionary period in Russia. So this is like 1917 is the major year of the Russian Revolution. Um, in the city of Petrograd, which is now called St. Petersburg, second largest city in Russia at the time. The most well-known and probably powerful of these Soviets, these workers and soldiers councils, was the Petrograd Soviet. Um, uh, in early 1917, this is known as the February Revolution. There is a mass protest and strike, mostly led by women, over the matter of lack of food in the empire. And these demonstrations ultimately end with the abdication of the Tsar, the emperor. And this is effectively the end of the Russian Empire. And what fills the void of the empire is a provincial government, which is largely headed by moderate socialists and liberals. But also, at the same time, there are these Soviets, these councils that are popping up all over the former empire. The most prominent one being in the city of Petrograd. And because these are developing at the same time, so we have this old style, like top-down government that's kind of trying to form, but there's also this very clear grassroots style government or governments that are being built in each of the municipalities in Russia. That are amassing more and more participants. So urban workers, peasants in the rural areas, soldiers, especially many of whom were leaving the front lines of the First World War. They were going AWOL and heading home. Most people were fed up with the First World War at the time. And they are engaging in direct action and are working toward the governance of their own municipalities, their own workplaces and such. And they exist kind of in a tension with the provincial government that's trying to be this old school Republican top-down style government. And usually this is referred to by a term called dual power. So the term dual power describes this tension between a bottom-up popular body, a democratic body, and a top-down um, government apparatus that is loosely held together by political parties or by certain military forces. Um, that's where leverage really begins to be significant. The leverage in that situation is that most average people are becoming involved, or at least are recognizing these grassroots assemblies as the legitimate governments in any municipality. Um, so
So at a very limited, at a very local level, then it would be power, right? There would
that's
be a
power.
real opportunity for power. So that the city would then, whatever that formal government body is, it's going to acquiesce to the input of the People's Assembly, whatever it is, even if it's just on a cause.
Yep. And this is strikingly similar to, and it was arguably partly influenced by the American Revolution. The American Revolution became something of a model for the French revolutionaries, Russian revolutionaries, and others, because in the 13 colonies and what became the United States, very similarly, it was town meetings, people in municipalities, and confederated together, coordinating with another in what were provincial assemblies. So like there would be an assembly for Massachusetts, an assembly for Vermont, an assembly for New York, where delegates, not representatives, and I can describe the difference, where delegates were sent from each of the municipal meetings or municipal assemblies to this more general form to coordinate, to form committees, and to carry out needed actions to execute decisions in unison, in concert with one another. And during the Revolutionary period, um, as new committees are forming, as these committees are confederating with one another across regions, um, especially what were called the committees of safety, which were something like executive bodies on local levels that were mostly used to bully royalists, some royalists who were loyal to the king were sometimes even dispossessed of their property at the barrel of a gun. That doesn't mean the guns were shot so often, but they were threatened with force.
Well,
Uh,
and that's actually a tactic that's been used in union organizing for years, right? Ostracizing, even fellow workers who don't comply.
yeah,
That's
it's also as simple as so something that the American revolutionaries would often do was to create blacklists as well.
yeah,
Today we would
yeah.
call it doxing. So a committee of safety in a town might put together a list of known loyalists to the king and print them in newspapers that were distributed around, and it would ruin those businesses that were owned by the royalists. So that also served as a very effective tactic, and actually a lot of the royalists ended up hightailing it to Canada as a result of that.
Dane
Uh,
had a question earlier. I think we kind of hijacked Dane's question, or I did. So, Dane, you still have a question, comment?
I was just kind of like around commissions and what the responsibility of the commissions, like, from what Zach was talking about, had me thinking about like, I know on homeless as an example, like having that community, it seems like reading the roles of Roseburg's commissions, like the homeless commission is supposed to advise the city council on guidance, but maybe that's where that, inviting this general based community homeless organization into the meetings so that they can kind of guide the discussions because I don't know if our city government and Roseburg really knows what a commission is for. It should be making recommendations on homelessness and guiding the city council on like maybe bathrooms, instead of people having to use buckets and dump them on the river is one example. But,
Yeah.
it was just kind of, as Zach was talking, I was thinking about like grassroots. How do we make a commission work and how do we make that communication with the general community if there is a general community homeless commission, bringing them kind of in as an advisory board to the homeless commission would be kind of a good guidance, is like that way we could get, hey, here's people out in the field that are doing this because, and I think they're going to have to change some of the rulings, because looking at the rulings, there's supposed to be a member from specific organizations in there. And I don't think that most of them have resigned the positions like you can and the
Right, in
UHA
the
and
medical, yeah, yeah.
Viva Health. Um,
I
I
think
think
they did
ADAPT was
change
less
some
of
of it.
the Cow Creek tribe. And so I think they were going more general community members, but I was just kind of confused on the guidance of what, I don't know if the city of Roseburg really knows what a commission is supposed to be doing.
Well, and I think, Jane, you bring up a really great point, which is, I think a lot of these commissions, especially around our area, are really detached. And to speak more to Zach's points, when he brought up Soviets, if it's under my recollection that the Soviets were usually centered around what they did. Like you were saying, a soldier Soviet or a manufacturing Soviet or an agricultural. So they understood the actual implications of the decisions they were making. Because I mean, I think it's a too far, people will get on their high horse and then really it's like, when was the last time you were really homeless and had to put up with these things? I think I was really disappointed when I went to the League of Women Voters town hall here recently for one of many things. But what I hated about when the officers and they got up in the meeting was the sense of otherism. They can't have dogs, they can't have porta potties because they'll neglect it. Not we'll neglect it. Not that we can understand that humans would like the company of a companion or the safety of, you know what I mean? We don't understand that just as we're humans. That's a collective understanding that we would like that. But it's just this give and take of we don't understand anymore.
Well, so I need to push back a little bit, because when we say it is very easy to say, well, our city councils don't understand what a commission is for. These are advisory boards, and they should be listening to what these advisory boards have to say. And these advisory boards should be stocked with people who are educated in one way or another, but in particularly through firsthand experience of the issues that these advisory boards pertain to. The problem with this assertion is that that isn't what these commissions exactly are for historically. So I could talk a lot about town meeting systems and popular assemblies and provincial assemblies in the American Revolutionary period. But what's really important for us today is what happens in the 1780s. In the 1780s, so this is in the wake of the American Revolutionary War, there are continued popular uprisings against the new governments in the early United States. These were in part due to levying of hard taxes to make up for war debts, and also farmers, like in Western Massachusetts, many of whom had served in the Continental Army, were being dispossessed of their homes and their farmsteads, having been sunk into debt, and were at the mercy of like Boston merchants. There's a very famous uprising called Shays' Rebellion, which is one of the major examples of this in Western Massachusetts. Um, and the response to these developing popular uprisings, which really aimed to topple the new ascendancy of the professional and merchant classes, the planter classes in the early United States. The inclination was toward potentially another revolution, an insurrection that would topple even these and establish a more broad democratic republic, rather than what was shaping up to be a highly proprietarian republic that worked mainly in the favor of the enslaving planter class, of the increasingly enriched mercantile classes and financial classes, uh, and the higher tier professional classes. Uh, the U.S. Constitution is really what uh, seals the democratic um, forms that persisted through the revolution into the 1780s. 1787 U.S. Constitution is drafted and is first being signed. There is no popular involvement in its creation at all. It is written and signed behind closed doors, and it maybe news to some people who don't know the history of the revolution so well. It effectively mimics the British Constitution, merely replacing the role of the monarch with that of what we now call the president. And this was so much the case that even John Adams himself noted that this was a basically monarchistic form, favorably, favorably for John Adams. Alexander Hamilton was another major peddler of this.
I
Contra
remember a professor, a history professor, saying it was a coup d'etat. The Second Continental Congress,
yeah,
was a coup d'etat
yeah,
and was behind closed doors. The elite didn't like Shays' Rebellion, right? They didn't like what they
yeah.
thought was too liberal of the
So
structure before.
some basic points of contention against the domination by the British Empire had been with regard to the king's control of the court system, the king having a standing army at his command. These were concerns, these were understood as key threats to freedom going back to the earlier periods, a century before the American Revolution in England, what was called the Glorious Revolution in 1688, which led to really the increased ascendancy of Parliament. These were similarly key concerns then that were reiterated as something that was resurging in the late 18th century during the American Revolution. And so these same fears that were understood by revolutionaries to be threats to freedom were being reinstituted in the form of the US Constitution by the end of the 1780s. Importantly for our discussion of municipalism, this has a more regional and municipal dimension to it. So around the same period, so during the 1780s, there are actually pretty radical forms of new government that had been created. Pennsylvania is probably one of the better examples. Pennsylvania had organized a unicameral legislature that was not not entirely directly democratic, but had a character not terribly unlike a House of Representatives as we know it today. So it was understood to be at least reflective of the popular will, and was not um, stamped out so hard by an upper chamber, what we now call a Senate. But in the 1780s, especially with the pressure of well, one of the wealthiest, actually, I think he was the wealthiest person in the early United States, Robert Morris. Um, there was a movement to impose a bicameral legislature through the state systems. And actually, in Pennsylvania, the now second Pennsylvania state constitution ended up implementing a bicameral legislature, which includes an upper chamber or a Senate, which in virtually um, uh, every modern revolutionary movement has been understood to be an effectively aristocratic um, top-down, and anti-populist political body. So snuffing out of democratic tendencies as best as they can. On the municipal level, during the 1780s, there is a move to replace town meetings and popular assemblies with what we now know as county commission systems and city councils, as we understand them, in various forms, but generally favoring the installation of local notables who were materially um, um, materially in advantageous relationship to the financial and planter classes of the early United States. Um, by the time we hit the mid 19th century, so 60, 70 years later, and this would be even pre-Civil War, the U.S. is moving to expand its borders out west and slaughtering Indians all along the way. Genocide, by the way. Um, it is expanding that system, not the old popular assembly systems, but the local forms of top-down governance and administration that were seen as favorable to the financial class, to the professional classes, to capital, that were understood to be the way to facilitate the movement of capital into new territories, to establish property rights in new territories under the protection of the U.S. federal government, to establish new enterprises or to expand enterprises with the protection of the U.S. federal government. Um, these were tools for empire building. It is not um, uh, it is not separable from what we face in the everyday in Southern Oregon, in Douglas County. Our county commission system is the product of that. Our city councils are products of that. And at their worst, too, their nascent forms were used to the advantages of mobs of settlers who organized together and secured funds for themselves to stalk the hills of Southern Oregon and kill every Indian they could possibly find. These are forms of domination, flatly. And so when we're talking about a commission and a city council, we have to understand that these are established basically for the advantaging or for the um, favorable appearance of these local forms of government that function even practically today as local oligarchies. Um, the major difference, of course, between the government out in DC and government in Douglas County is that we can at least know and confront these local politicians where they live, at
Yeah,
the very
we can
least.
hunt them down and find them. We have their addresses.
Well,
They
and
all live near us.
So the commissions, though, I think there are two sides to understanding what a commission is and what a commission could be. So uh, to bring it back to the concept of libertarian municipalism understands that these bodies are basically established to be anti-democratic. Uh, while we should press for the installation of members of our communities who are willing to fight the power, so to speak, to be a wrench in the machine, uh, to even to hopefully further some reforms that might, alleviate ills in our lives immediately in the short term. Uh, Ultimately, these are advisory bodies. They are not beholden to the people, so to speak. And even our city councils and county commissions themselves are not beholden to these commissions because they are only advisory. A city council can effectively ignore recommendations as they see fit, and as they see fit tends to be in the direction of whatever will uh, favor the expansion of capital, of further domination and control of any one community. Um, that stands in sharp contrast to the kinds of committees that existed during the American Revolutionary period, and that I think are necessary to build as part of a new municipalist agenda. So, a committee that is not associated with City Hall, not created by City Hall, but is created by a popular assembly serves a bit of a different function. They can serve still as advisory boards, as focus groups to consider and deliberate specific issues, but their members are elected. They're not just appointed at the decision of a city councilor. The popular assemblies elect who sits on these commissions. These commissions also are not being filled with representatives, but delegates who report back to the main body of the popular assembly, and in turn can also be revoked by the popular assembly. So if somebody is on a commission and is not doing a good job, so the popular assembly, neighbors who are coming together, see, they can vote to take them off of the committee and stick somebody else in there.
I think that's a little bit grandiose to what we're planning for the for the People's Homeless Commission at this point. You know, what we're looking at, and this happened in 2015 here, there was HTAG, which still exists, was assembled to bring all the people who may touch the lives of homeless people who could, very similar to some degree to the homeless commissioner that the commission that the mayor put into place, to leverage the coordination and service delivery primarily to get these people working together to address homelessness, right? It was viewed as, okay, there's agencies out here already doing medical, mental health, there's UCAN, there's housing providers. All these people need to be in one room talking about what's going on and why they're not doing their job. Why do we have homeless people? This was what HTAG came about. It is an agency-oriented organization to this day, and it meets and it talks about supplies and it has its role. But the idea behind the People's Homeless Commission is really to kind of address the real stalemate, which are these people, run them out of town, put them in jail, which is complete, utter problematic because we don't have the funding to even do that. And it's not a practical solution, but trying to get together people to say, okay, what is the most practical solution to end homelessness and to manage it humanely, period. It's a very, specific goal that I think needs to have people that I wouldn't normally sit at the table with talking about homelessness issues, because talking in our own silos doesn't really help. And to answer your question, Melissa, yes, the city, I think it was 2019, contracted for experts out of Portland, I believe, to do a report on the status of homelessness in Roseburg, and it's up online. Actually, Housing First Umpqua, has a copy of it if you want to see it. But I think it's like I said, I think it's 2019 is when the report was out there. And unfortunately, with the data with homelessness, the police department is reporting about 300 people on the street right now in Roseburg. the numbers were way lower in 2019. And so, and some of the agencies that are cited in there, that report needs to be redone. But one of the other things I want to mention, but I want to get to some questions. There was a couple of one um, that were asked in the chat. So let's see. Um, yeah, that Melissa's question about the study. Yeah. And then Larry says, how has technology affected our public policy process? It allows for more research from which to make informed decisions. I'm going to chime in just because I do this stuff. It does provide more information, Larry. The internet does. I mean, I used to do legal research by hand. Okay, it's way better to be able to find stuff on the internet if you know how to look, right? If you know where it is, if it's organized in a manner. But I don't know that. I think that how Zach described these the public policy process is, I think that the homeless commission was the same group of people. They didn't have any homeless advocates on it. God forbid homeless people would have been on it, period. This was the first one. This time, Dane may actually get on there, or someone who advocates and is in that arena. But this has to run parallel. This really is not going to integrate into it. It's probably going to end up making demands, because the reality is if people wanted to do the right thing, they've been given information by many people in this community of what to do is right, the city council. And I will tell you, if the homeless commission does not say what the city council wants, they do not care. And I will say the needle exchange issue. I was at the homeless commission meeting when they discussed removing needle exchange from the parks. And the homeless commission, because Dane had gone up there and spoke about how they were trying to modify, what HIV Alliance was doing. And the homeless commission seemed to be fine with that. But the city that very night ignored the whole thing and voted on the first reading of an ordinance to ban the distribution of needle exchange in the parks. So even if they did better, Larry, the city wouldn't listen to them, is my point of view in dealing with the city. And you don't get on a commission if you, and no offense if you get on there, Dane, but if you're almost somebody willing to rubber stamp it. I didn't even bother the other times there was openings, because if they wanted people who knew stuff, they wanted people who were going to speak truth to power, which they don't want, there's people that have already been on the commission. So the homeless commission. So that's really the kind of the motivation why I'm involved in the People's Homeless Commission. So,
I
and
was just
let
going
me
to
see.
state that needle exchange really isn't something the homeless commission should be talking about, because only a small percentage of the people that are homeless are using illicit substances. Unlike what they said in that meeting last week, is that 90+% are using illicit substance. Now, alcohol, mental health, then illicit substance, because we have data that shows that we're serving 25 people a week. And on average. So it's not, and we could go into unduplicate that if we needed to, but it was pretty much the same people every single week. So, I think that's more of a public health issue and not necessarily a homeless issue, because a lot of people
Right.
that live in a house use illicit substances too. It just, I don't
I'd
know.
say the majority of people in Douglas County who use illegal substances are housed.
Yeah.
Let's get that reality check. And you're right. It's why it's always annoyed me conflating it with homelessness, right? Here's the cause. So if you just got sober, you'd be housed. But we don't even have the housing. But I don't want to go, I don't want to rant about that. I can say that for another time. So Melissa, then there was a comment, unless Zach, you want to chime in on is it allows more research, Larry's technology thing, but Bailey says it also makes information and misinformation spread at the speed of light. And
Yeah.
I mean, look at us here. Previous revolutionaries had to take time to go to physical places in order to meet. Now we have Zoom, and we can't even get organized effectively with Zoom. Maybe that's another program.
Yeah.
Zach, you want to chime
I
in, and
would, I
then
would, I would
then
agree. I would
Melissa
agree
wanted to
with
say
that.
something.
The internet is it's an amazing tool, but you do have to know how to use it, and you have to have a certain literacy in order to be able to parse the massive amounts of information that one comes across.
True.
So information alone, the quantity of information alone, does not inherently come with higher quality of knowledge, understanding, and education.
Oh
That
yeah,
comes
and
through
you're
this course.
yes, you're absolutely right. And that's the one thing that really made me think about this People's Homeless Commission, which has been on my mind for a while. Just because when I talk to certain people, even in jobs, that are like case manager jobs, and they don't know what the housing first model is, that is, the problem of information, right? There is, and if you start Googling homelessness, you get all kinds of crap, right? You get legitimate sources. There are some that I consider very reliable, that I rely upon, but I've been doing this for 20, 40 years. Shit. Now that I think about it, right? You're right. And so, mm, and my expectation is unrealistic because I do know so much to expect everybody in town to not have just this simple knee-jerk reaction. But they do, but that's normal, right? So how do the idea of how to overcome that? But even if I pointed somebody to internet searches, there's volumes and volumes of stuff about studies about addiction and homelessness, veterans and homeless, healthcare and homeless, and how do the average person, maybe with this People's Assembly, some of us who actually know that can start bringing that information and having it in a discussion format as opposed to a lecture format.
Melissa, you wanted to chime in?
Yeah, I just and maybe this is not the place for it, but Betsy, I was wondering um if you wanted to give a brief overview of the meeting that the League of Women Voters had, because I know there are several people on this call who wanted to be there but couldn't. Um, do you want to give us a like kind of a rundown of what happened or what your takeaways were, or is this not the time for that?
Well, I don't know. I want to spend too much time on talking about that.
Yeah.
I do plan on doing probably under the Housing First Umpqua moniker, but I had a problem from the get-go because I think it was actually Francis who forwarded me an email, and I saw the sweep cop and Bernie Woodard being the people, the League of Women Voters of all entities, bringing only those two to talk about homelessness in Roseburg.
Yeah.
I don't know what's wrong with the League of Women Voters, but that ain't the kind of thing the League of Women Voters done. I've been involved in the Right to Rest Act numerous times here that we attempted to go through this legislature. And one of the, consistent organizations in support of the right to rest and a homeless bill of rights is actually the Oregon League of Women Voters. And so to me, to have the two people who are probably going to give the negative side without an advocate side, I did contact them and offer to give something what I understood I was going to be given, some time at the end to kind of, say some things that I, only prepared 5 minutes because I knew they wanted to do a question and answer. And when I got there, apparently the person who had represented that to me had forgotten. And so it'd be more, a disruptor. I am not beneath being a disruptor in a public place. And that is a tactic that sometimes has to be used. But the issue is that Bernie Woodard is illegally making people work at least 3 hours a day in these camps, for no pay. And you know, they're not just working in the camps, they're working in their private for-profit business that he owns. He and this Richard Weber own in some partnership. They're the ones on the paperwork for Elk Island Trading Group LLC, which he's been around buying property. But there's also another contracting company under Richard Weber's name. So as we look into this kind of mess of this, what's going on with this situation, and he also formed a nonprofit that he's using the name of the nonprofit as a cover for making people work for nothing. And it just doesn't, it's not legally, you can't legally do that. And Bernie Woodard has, snowed people that I have respect for, who've been supporting it, who want to believe that it's a good thing because they want people to have a place to be. I don't disagree with the place. I don't disagree with people taking care of their own space in there, taking care of the common areas of the space that they're in. Um, but everything he does is inconsistent with best practices regarding, the trauma-informed care and all the things that people need when they're living on the street. And he does not provide anything but tents place, right? Or, gets people in the community, to donate, to give tents to people that are living in his space. We have a Joe Carroll is up on the Housing for Umpqua YouTube TV is what it is called. It's actually there's a link in the Facebook group to Joe Carroll's story, who is somebody who lived there. That information I will say here that information, that video, and there's a reporter in Jefferson Public Radio who did a really good expose about Bernie and questioned, the whole scheme I just mentioned in an article before he got the money from Grants Pass. Um, and there was also an audio file that I had created to explain the wage issue because, it's what constitutes an employee, that kind of stuff. That was sent to the president of the League of Women Voters a week before the event. And that is why I believe she said, it's going to give me time to speak. Why it didn't happen, I don't really care. The problem that I do care about is it really harms homeless people for all the people in that audience to hear that bullshit without a
Yeah.
counter presence being there. And there will be there will be a counter, but it's going to be online, and we're going to just have to make sure that the information gets out there. And because even if it is for the nonprofit, they cannot coerce people to work for a tent space. Even a
Yeah.
nonprofit cannot do that. Okay. And so there's not just wage laws, there's other kind of employment related laws, both on a federal and a state level, that what they're doing. And then to add insult to injury, the city of Roseburg knows about this problem. I've not only brought it up at a city council meeting, I, over a year ago informed the people that issued the permits that they're charging a fee. There's not supposed to be any fee for these camp spaces. Well, if you're making somebody work 3 hours a day at what's an equivalent of $14.05 an hour under Oregon minimum wage law, that seems to be a hefty fee for a dirt space for a tent camp in Oregon. Anyway, so that's why I didn't want to talk about it, but thanks for asking. I'm going to stop there. Um, so,
Well,
I was very frustrated by the police officer. I found him very problematic,
oh
and
yeah.
I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that was the real problem that I saw of having just those two. Um,
Yeah.
and I will give him credit. He didn't really harp on people wanting to be there. He did mention it once, but sometimes that's when the cops talk. Oh, those people just want to live down there. Bullshit.
Well,
Okay.
yeah, and all these resources they have access to. I'm like, oh, where are all these imaginary resources? He kept talking about
Oh, they
all
are
these
imaginary.
resources. Yeah, all these resources they have access to, but they just won't take advantage of them. I'm like, what resources?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
and I know that people who are out there are, kind of that do outreach all the time, like probably HIV Alliance workers and even Adapt and UCAN. I'm sure that they're strained because they don't have a lot of options to help people. So to even say that somebody could go and get housed, they're lying. All
Yeah.
right. I mean, and HIV Alliance has a good reputation among folks that I talk to who are living outside. The other ones, not necessarily so. There is a resistance because of a perception that folks who are living outside have.
I think like UCAN's doing a good job, but it's 15 to 20 people a month. And that's
Right.
all they have 6 spaces. There's just not enough resources as far as like, so I would argue with Chavez, like, okay, so UCAN is out in the field every single day trying to get people and cycle them through those 6 spaces into better places. Same thing that Laura is doing at the navigation center. But the gap is we do not have, and you need wraparound services to once you place those people in there, you need an agency that's going to help support that person maybe a year or 2 years. It could be 3. There's no timeline on a lot of these individuals.
And some of it is actually permanent supportive housing. I mean, that's the one thing that I had to, eventually accept. I've supported the Housing First model since I first learned about it in the 80s because it was actually used for mental health patients in the 80s. It's connected to back east, but LA was using it when I was living there and do homeless organizing in the 1980s. The mental health system was using that homeless first model to pick people up off the street and put them directly into housing as they do case management, but also living in an apartment complex that's low income with people with it's a senior and disabled building. I have watched 3 people over the time I've been here get into housing who had severe and persistent mental health issues, but that support goes away and they end up getting evicted because of behaviors that nobody's there to try to help them with. And I think that's the flaw that people have. I hope that with the homeless commission, those are the kind of things I think the general public, if we can bring enough in, need to start understanding about what is available really, you know. And agencies sometimes will say, oh, yeah, you can send somebody down here, but they don't tell you. Well, they might not get seen for, months. They may not get anything for months, So
Well, and
anyway,
I think that's our America's problem of hyper analyzing things because I mean, like you were just talking about, Betsy, there's analysts about veterans in housing and addiction in housing, all these different things. When frankly, it could be it's a simple answer. You know what I mean? A house and universal health care and food. Everybody would be happy. It takes less money that way in the long run. And I mean, we were talking about when we were at the Housing Commission, Bernie Woodard brought up the E. coli stuff and around the rivers. It's like, well, I see you've identified the problem, which is amazing. I 100% agree with you. We need to, address the amount of human waste going everywhere. But you're just one step too short. Let's just get some blue rooms out there. Let's get a septic service so we're not doing these things. You're just one step short of the solution, which is doesn't have to be complex and oh, they have to blah blah blah. It's just why can't they go to the bathroom somewhere? Why can't they have adequate housing? You know what I mean?
yeah, duh, they're going poop in the bushes. Well, yeah, where do you want them to go poop? Right. You apparently you want them to go poop there because you're not providing a toilet so they have an option to go somewhere else. Yeah, the public policy around homelessness just drives me crazier.
Well, and going back into why that's the importance for the local Roseburg and Douglas County Homeless Commission, Public Homeless Commission, I think, is because I mean it goes back into the idea of community rights, which immediately got me interested in the first place, which is citizens representing themselves, which doesn't happen a lot, especially in Douglas County. And to go farther into that, what are the things that we can do to address this problem locally besides, the Public Homeless Commission, which is what we've got steps on. I think, we obviously address the problem that we have a kind of authoritarian commission right now, county commission, you know what I mean? They're very hard strung. They're very good old boys. I see very hopeful in the county commissioners we've got, but I mean, they're just so entrenched. Yeah, it's hard to not see somebody I've seen there for my 24 years be gone, you know what I mean? So it's almost like, what's the next step? And I always try to bring into this next conversation is a charter reform, something that we can get the public or something all together to really talk about and start that community dialogue of how are we going to change the county? Because right now it's just all out of whack. We've got three people in a geographic area less than 20 miles apart. But then, you know what I mean? People out on the coast are feeling left out, but frankly, they're getting the most money in the county just by all the money getting put out there by Winchester Bay. It's so weird. You know what I mean? And that's just one of the things I think community rights and the inclusion of a bigger county charter to affect the commission is a conversation that should be had.
At some point, I think on the county level and changing that is absolutely right. There has to be that go after that again. But I'm going to read some of the comments that Kat said it's always set up by the rich for the rich and to control the poor unless it's bloody lawless rabble. That is the way it will be. It is a civilized way. It's the rules are set by the ruling class. It will not be an advantage to the poor. I'm a comedian I listened to, I think I mentioned this. It's maybe last week here. He said, if you're, I never believe a violent revolution is going to happen because they have more guns and bigger guns. They can kill us all. So I don't know how bloody it's going to get on the street of, Roseburg as it might have on the streets of Paris. But uh, I do think there needs to be a revolution. I would certainly agree. And I think, at this point, it's the ballot box, how that, you know, works out. Hopefully people will start to be smarter. I don't know. Larry says Roseburg Homeless Population Study 2019 by Christina Smock, 39 pages, including funding options. Some of which, like I mentioned earlier, may be outdated. There is a lot of stuff on that. I know that our person who does our policy stuff for Housing for Somewhat, was looking through that and trying to update it, try to get data, and sometimes you don't have really good data that is available just on public searches. Um, and Bailey indicated it's often harder and more sacrificial to do the right thing. That's why they don't care, not unless they're forced to. I'm afraid you're right about that. And Larry suggested that we all read the last 5 years of the point in time reports, apparently showing that drugs are not 95% of the problem. And I think that, Dane, I really do appreciate you bringing that up in a thread, somewhere about that this is a misrepresentation, that 95%. But I think this is why the way it went down, that those folks were harmful to addressing the problem, is because they misrepresent that data. And it's certainly anecdotal information, but I don't even think you can look someone's behavior and say, oh, they're on drugs versus they're having a mental health episode, right? Uh, Cops may know that they can distinguish it, but I'm not always sure that's true. Lori said discourse aligns community, hopefully. Um, and data seems to be lacking in most conversation, having the facts, having those living perspective, the emotional drives the conversation, then facts and figures. That's true. That's a problem though, that people are so emotional and think they know that and then they believe everybody's an addict. That's going to drive nonsense, because even if they are, where are you going to get them treatment? What are you going to do with them? You're, going to send them to Utah where, Trump is building a concentration camp for homeless.
I wanna
Let's
I
see.
wanna I wanna address
Go ahead.
comments. So to go back to Catherine and Bailey's comments. So Catherine's on uh something always being set up by the rich for the rich, presuming the government, always being set up by the rich for the rich and to control the poor. Rules are set by the ruling class. And Bailey's It's often harder, more sacrificial to do the right thing. That's why they don't care, not unless they're forced to. Um, so the key problem that comes to my mind here that libertarian municipalism has a critique of is yes, I agree, Catherine, that when we're speaking of, say, a county commission like the one that exists, yes, historically it is set up by the rich. But more importantly than being just set up by the rich, in the sense that it's positioned for their advantage. Materially, it is set up for the advancement and securing of profits, the expansion of capital into every corner of the country and beyond that. That's to say, it doesn't matter as much who is sitting on those boards, on those commissions or councils, than the forms themselves. Who is sitting in those seats does matter to a certain degree. Like you could have a Chris Boyce on a council or committee commission, or you could have Lori Wick on there. And in many regards, you're going to have some pretty stark differences in the approach to governance. But because these forms are established for the advancement of capital, even somebody who has the best of intentions will ultimately have to cave to it at one point or another. This actually happened last year on the Roseburg City Council. Katie Williams and Zach Weiss, both on the Roseburg City Council, were well informed and asked some pretty pointed questions on the matter of the ripping apart and turfing of Fir Grove Park in Roseburg, which is still underway and stoppable, folks. Um, they ultimately opted to vote in favor of moving the project forward on the basis of it being an opportunity for the community. That's to say, it brings investment, hypothetically, to the community. It brings capital into the community. So even if somebody is professedly and even to some certain degree ecologically conscious, whatever that means, or they're professedly attentive to public opinion to some degree or another, they can still jettison all of that because in their role, they are expected to maintain the community. And the community, so a city like Roseburg, county like Douglas, is deeply dependent at this historical point on capital investment. Without robust systems of mutual aid and popular politics, that capitulation to capital and thus the destruction ultimately of our communities with it, the further domination of our communities is going to continue. No matter who sits in office, there will be capitulations. Um, on Bailey's point, so it's often harder and more sacrificial to do the right thing. That's why they don't care. The sacrifice is sacrificing the entire community when you're dependent on capital alone, which we are in communities, not just in Southern Oregon, but in Oregon on the whole, in the United States, in many, many parts of the world. People have asked me like, why did the Oregon State Legislature and the governor push for this the building of a new baseball stadium on the waterfront in the center of Portland? It's because they need the capital from foreign investors because Oregon's in a real budget crisis and there is not adequate um, popular mutualistic forms of economy that can meet those needs, mostly because they have been eroded by that encroachment of capital. And so, as much as it is important for us to run candidates for county commission seats, for city councils, et cetera, to get reformers on these bodies, ultimately we have to move away from these bodies as such. We need new forms of politics, not just new politicians. Um, I could go on forever. I've got a whole list of more things about
Well,
municipalism.
we're at 7:48. So,
Yeah.
the last week was, the longest we've ever gone. I think it was actually after 2 hours, and people already complaining when it was it went after an hour. Uh, so uh Um, I just want to actually just address some of the comments I made that Larry said Roseburg should commission primary research projects to study our local homeless population that goes beyond the point in time count. It starts with a question guide. What do we need to know to make informed decisions? The point in time count does, ask some questions, is a little bit more detailed. But when Housing for Some revitalized itself in the summertime, what the first thing we started doing is doing surveys primarily around Deer Creek Park and to Gaddis Park, talking to people about, things about what's going on, what they need, what would take to get them in there, into, where would they go? Because the idea is, what would work for you to at least have the living conditions you're living in right now better. How could that be made better? And, not surprising, one of the things is toilets. But also it went into a little bit more detail about what an individual needs, mental health issues. I don't think there was anybody out there in the survey that we did not have a disability. And so, and Dane did make a comment that they may have to be sued on ADA, the city may, and that may be what they need to be sued on. And it's one of the things that Housing for Umpqua has looked for people to do those cases, because I mean, I'm talking about even people who are victimized, that it's really really hard to get people who are living on the street to be able to um even access that kind of assistance. I think that, I unfortunately, I use a comparison. In the 80s, I used to do homeless outreach to crackheads who were actually, we could organize. We actually were able to organize folks, who were smoking crack in the 80s in Long Beach, and deal with city council issues, get actually a porta potty in the place that they were living. And I used to joke that my claim to fame of all my organizing in California is at least got Long Beach, the city of Long Beach, give people porta potties. And then I come up here and it's still a fight decades later about porta potties. Public policy is insane. The local public safety coordinating council does maintain records. Um, uh, Dane mentioned them. They're actually a county committee that's actually mandated by state law and has to do with recidivism. It's not really a local public safety coordinating council. You might imagine it actually is specific to a jail and people coming out of jail. And there is a weekly meeting, but I will say that when we first started doing outreach in last summer, again, I went to one of the connecting point, the one that's out there at the on Winchester, and the people there really couldn't provide anybody anything. So the service providers may be there, people show up, but there was not anything really concrete other than information about, overdose prevention, naloxone, that is something, but there was no housing. I talked to people about phones. I'm talking about the providers there, and actually nobody could immediately meet anybody's need that needed shelter or and so, even having that, it's great, but if there's no place for people to go, it still is a problem. I do think that I do though agree with what Larry said, that the city should actually be more active in finding out what is needed from the people. But I think that the homeless, there's People's Homeless Commission that's probably going to end up being part of their task to make sure that we have that data on it. And one of the things is this commission can't exist without people who are actually living outside being part of it. I mean, they have to be, people providing input and have a seat at the table, not just having, outreach workers go ask them, what they want and report back. That's not the way to do that. So did I get through everybody's question? Um, Kat points out that, these votes don't really require unanimous position. I'm assuming she's talking about the vote for the city council and the turf. People need to stand for their principles. And, if somebody goes along to get along, I'm going to tell you, not necessarily somebody I want to vote for. There's nothing wrong with voting your principles unless you want to keep the people at the dais with you happy, as opposed to, have the support your principles. I don't know what it is, but I will tell you that's one of the things I noticed about a rural area that's different than an urban area. Is what seems to be that tendency to just want to be liked as opposed to make good public policy.
Larry has a
And
question in the
yeah,
chat that I should answer. So yes,
yeah, go ahead.
are there any examples of where capitalism and socialism balance out? That's a great question. Historically, no. And that's for the very basic reason that capitalism is premised on the acquisition of profits above all else and the expansion of markets into uh, ever greater areas of life. And because of that, it comes into conflict with society as such. It has historically tended to erode basic social ties, to say nothing of community control over resources, of basic material goods, of even interpersonal relations. It encroaches into um, every area you can imagine. So it does not have that. It does not have that capability. I would think of it like a cancer. Like you could live with cancer for a little while, but it is killing you. You either have to kill it, you have to get it out of your body, or it will kill you. And we
I
are,
think it's becoming more challenging as we move forward because, like I put in the chat, like we've already seen the behavioral health resource networks. They got cut last year on the budget, and that's what funds treatment access, harm reduction resources, the people, and some of the resources. So they got cut again this year, 16%. They were based on the marijuana tax, and more people need to start smoking marijuana so we can get that tax up so that we have more money. But I think, I was listening to some of the um Senate bills, and if it has money, there is none. We're going to have a huge budget crunch for the state of Oregon. So funding is going to be, and we're not even seeing the effects of HR1, which a lot of it rolls out for like insurance in 2027, and what's going to happen when we don't have people on OHP anymore.
It's going
It's
to
going
be
to be
harder
challenging.
because I was doing outreach here when they didn't have OHP expanded generally. And we ran into a lot of, particularly younger people, but actually it was middle-aged, that had no insurance. Right. So if they had any substance abuse issues, how are you going to get help for them? Right. If they have mental health issues, and we even know people that are still on the street today never have gotten benefits because of their mental health issues, because that they would be otherwise entitled to. So we have a system that's even broke on that level, right? Um, so they would probably qualify for SSI is what I'm saying, but because of their mental health issues, they are not willing to participate and determine
And I mean,
eligibility.
I have seen huge in my 8 years, like with the peer support services that exist now that didn't exist, when I started. We have a lot more supportive ability, but
Yeah.
it all requires OHP.
That's right.
And, I mean, we really need more support, like peer support around SSI, like you just said, Betsy, the people going to the streets, working a case manager that's walking these people through these processes, getting them enrolled, same thing, I mean, we just need a lot more bodies. I mean, I think, and, I've seen successes, but we could have more success if we have more support out there doing specific items like if it's mental health, like why don't we have behavioral health that's out on the street working with these individuals right there where they're at? Would be such a better model
Yes.
than expecting them to go somewhere to get that mental health. It's like, hey, just you know send to the streets
Oh
and
yeah.
have them meet with people right where they're at to see if what they can do to navigate that person's care right there at the moment. Those
Well,
medical provisions have been
yeah.
amazing to see when medical providers go to the street and meet people where they're at, and just kind of those models, have become more often, but we still have huge gaps. Like Douglas County and the ADAPT mobile unit going out is great, but we need to get it outside of Roseburg where it's going to Drain and Glide, Myrtle Creek, where people don't have resources and don't have more need, but it takes money.
Well, and I've lobbied, for before COVID, when Housing for Semquest started, Aviva to start a street medicine. And there's models. You don't have to reinvent that wheel. Somebody's already done it for you, okay? That are experts in how to, do outreach to people living out on the street in any country in the world. And there was resistance. There seems to be some weird territorial fighting, but we've always had through Medicaid the opportunity to have that if somebody has Medicaid, right? People just don't do that. They have this model of people have to show up at their front door, which is one of the biggest problems of substance abuse treatment and mental health treatment among people who are living outside. It's not a realistic model if you're to expect people to show up and you know get fixed whatever. And the whole premise of fixing, which is why housing first with the housing um is really was so critical. That stability is needed because to try to treat some of these issues, if somebody's living in the mud and muck, whether it's at Elk Island or if it's at Deer Creek, right? Neither one of those is a situation where really somebody can heal from being involved with it. And then a soft secession, I would say Bailey says a soft secession would be warranted, especially if it means funneling would-be tax dollars to the state itself. And then Zach said it would be suicide for Oregon to consider how reliant we are on federal funds. Can't do it without a robust democratic regional economy standing in contrast to the state. But didn't the state, weren't they among the other states that are trying to separate from the funding, paralleling, the feds, because the feds kind of control that?
Yeah, so the language in the Oregon State Legislature on our tax codes is one of, I think, 4 states that uniquely matches up automatically with changes in federal tax codes. I know at least folks I'm connected with through the AFT union are working on lobbying against or lobbying for a bill to change that language in the Oregon state law. It should be a simple fix, but it needs votes, of course. And it means that your legislators need to know about it. But when I'm saying it would be suicide for Oregon to even soft secede, we're already seeing what the effects of a soft secession would be. Take the transportation district in the Umpqua Valley, for example. The federal funds were slashed and whole bus routes were cut. That is a function of a kind of secession, except it's done in the opposite direction here. The federal government is seceding from the state of Oregon, in a certain sense. But it goes to show Oregon in particular really is, and counties like ours are really dependent on the federal government, especially because of things like the ONC Lands Act, that have, uh, I guess artificially might be the best word, have artificially uh, developed the basic conditions of life that we take for granted in our area, and stripped away of those funds, whether they're secured through that act or through the Secure Rural Schools Act or something of that sort. Stripped of those, we don't have as much means to even sustain the basics of the towns and cities that you know in Douglas County. So secession, I don't think so. But within the regions as they exist, something else can be created. Shadow economies can be created. Uh, like robust forms of mutual aid region wide, that can secure economic ties between municipalities, between even neighborhoods in a single city like Roseburg, um, that can distribute, that can organize, production, that can be manufacturing, but especially production of food. All those things would have to be, really developed in order for something like secession, if you want to go there, to even be possible.
Yeah, I did not expect this to be an overnight thing. I was sort of throwing the idea out there only because, one, I've heard it thrown out there, and two, it's because we're so dependent on the government, then it's like, well, shouldn't we look for ways to not be dependent on the government?
Well, ultimately, we're going to be dependent, on others beyond Douglas County, regardless. I mean, interdependence is something to think about. Like, I've heard discussions about, soft secessions before, um, but the only ways that they would be possible is if we were still tacked on to California and depended on California, because the ways of life as we've come to know them in Oregon, really have relied upon, outside, economic ties and finance.
Well, and particularly with the dependence of the timber industry in places like Douglas County, where for the 35 years we've lived here, there has been suggestions of diversifying the economy or looking at other ways, but this, hammering of people that are elected to the county commission, there's a, there was a debate about ONC association, right? We pay 100 and some $1,000 to be in a political lobbying group for the timber industry. The county commissioners do, and the mug of, Tim Freeman was, in the news review about, his getting reelected to the chair or whatever it is of the ONC Association. And that's really, even when I was doing work with displaced timber workers, the real big problem was how through the college, how do you retrain people to have the middle, the more middle income jobs that the timber industry created when you look around Douglas County, right? That's not an easy lateral change for anyone. So anyhow, this has been a great discussion. But Kat did say something about the problem with the Umpqua Transit is Steve and Michaela Amerson. But I'm going to say so. I was unfortunately listening to a podcast that Virgil Osborne was on in September. And he was very clear that he did not support public transportation at all. And like the trope they say about they're coming for your guns, he said something equal that they're coming for your cars. So they want to take away your cars, and we rely upon cars in rural Douglas County. So the problem is you don't have people even wanting to support the idea of public transportation, which people who've been here for what, 10, 15 years know there was no public transportation here when we got here, right? So, there was none. So and there is an economic situation, but it's, because it's a capitalist system, right? They don't look at the benefit of what transportation for people who don't have transportation, who live in rural areas, right? Even in the city of Roseburg, they've modified the transportation system to them. But on that note, does anybody have any, parting words? I'll just say that the homeless commission meeting, if anybody sees this before Tuesday at 6 p.m., you're welcome to come to the Democratic Party meeting. We won't have the meetings always there. We are looking for a place that can accommodate more people, that is free, is space that we can meet in as we start this process of doing the People's Homeless Commission. Lori, yeah, they do pay over $100,000 is the estimate that I could find. You'd have to look through the actual budget line item because I don't think it's in our budget as a line item. It's lumped in with some dues, but based on the assessment, because we have the most land, that's what I was reading, that it would be over $100,000 dues that we're paying for the ONC Association.
Mhm.
Anybody else want to say something?
I'd like to have more discussion. I mean, not tonight. I have to go to bed soon, but like, I'd like to meet. I would certainly like to meet up a little more, and I would like to meet up with some of you people on Signal.
Signal? Yeah, I have a Signal account. I just got one. The current government has made me paranoid enough. But obviously, I still do things like Google because we're out streaming out on YouTube. So, and I think that it would be a good thing to have opportunities. There's also might be other rooms, online stuff. I know that Zach and Kevin have been talking about history stuff, about learning more about the history of the economics in the world and the lies we've been told. Is going to be going on in separate from this. And then we're going to also launch a more civics oriented kind of snapshots of how how the government we have works. Okay. And how it says it should work. It's not advocating for our system. It's advocating for learning how our current system works enough so you actually can understand it and
Okay, I love
participate at
that. I
whatever
love
level.
that. I think one
So
big step. Sorry.
go ahead.
I was saying that people really need to learn the difference and the true distinction between this is what we have versus this is what we ought to have.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Kat, you want to say something?
I want to thank Zach so much for coming here and educating us and talking to us. Oh my God, you're awesome. And please come back or be available. I loved having you here. It was awesome.
He's normally here every week, and I almost put on your thing and smart guy, your intro, but I thought, uh um he's actually a wealth of knowledge. Absolutely, Kat. It's great to have him, involved. I think he ditched just for the Super Bowl last week, but he just doesn't want to admit it.
Oh,
No.
no, no, no,
He
I'm
no,
doesn't
joking. I
strike
know.
me as that kind of a
I know,
guy.
that's
no,
why
no,
I'm
no.
joking. I would
Oh,
not
no,
think that
no,
Zach would.
That that would be somebody else here. Oh, Kevin.
I'm on the communications committee for my union, and I have a responsibility to them as well sometimes.
Well,
Hey,
having you
listen,
here will bring me back. Having you here will bring me back. If you're going to be regular, I will come back.
I'm here most weeks, yes, so you should come back.
great.
Happy to chat.
all right. Thanks, Kat. So anybody else want to say anything before we go? All right.
Live strong, live well, stay safe, and talk to your neighbors, look out for your neighbors. In the end, all we have is each other.
Very true. All right.